next speaker says, as I mentioned before, we kind of did like a nonprofit and design aspect. Now we're going to get a few grower perspectives. And the first will be Mike Marshall. Mike Marshall is a colleague of mine here in Florida. He is the vice president of the Marshall Tree Farm, a 650-acre ball and burlap operation in north central Florida, which is kind of, not the norm in the state, I'd say. Containers very popular in Florida. He studied horticulture at the University of Florida under Ed Gilman, and is an active volunteer in the Florida green industry. He served as the president of the Florida Nursery Growers and Landscape Association, FNGLA, the national, and were you a president of the National Horticulture Foundation too? And the Florida chapter of ISA, and you were on the board of ISA, so you've been well represented in a lot of the nursery groups, both locally and nationally. So with that, I asked Mike to speak on grades and standards in Florida, which some of you have been talking about in the chat, and then how his business has used it to distinguish themselves among the competition. So thank you very much, Michael, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate the introduction and the invite, Andrew, and the organizers. I'm glad to bring a little bit of info from the great state of Florida to your meeting today. Like Andrew said, we grow all field-grown balled and burlap trees on about 650 acres. We sell 80% in the state of Florida, but we also sell up the East Coast into the Carolinas and out west into Texas. And, quality trees in Florida is something that we've been working really hard on for the last 30 or 35 years. The industry's really sort of changed from more of a cottage mom and pop into a more professional industry. So I'm happy to present on that to y'all today. So, when we talk about quality trees and when we talk about planting trees, right, we've heard the stories about, the quotes about when's the best time to plant a tree, right? 20 years ago. We all think when we're planting a tree, we want it to turn into this unbelievable canopy that we can enjoy for so long. And we've done a great job as an industry really teaching folks what the benefits are of these wonderful trees that we grow and plant and take care of. So we all know that we've done a good job on that. And there's a lot of steps involved in really taking the idea of a tree planting and turning it into that sort of success story, whether it's a small maturing success story, small maturing trees, or those large canopy trees like we just saw. And I like to think of it as sort of all these links in the chain, right? If we don't select the right trees or modify the site with the right amount of soil, so if we put the wrong tree in the wrong place, or if we don't know how to plant and establish the trees properly or maintain and care for them long term, we're going to have failure. Well, the quality of the trees is certainly one of the links in that chain. And if we don't start with quality, then we all know all of those other steps are still going to lead to failure. So why quality trees matter? You all know this probably as well or better than I do. But if we're going to have that success story, we're going to have to start with a quality tree. And these pictures at the bottom show trees that have probably been planted for less than 10 or 15 years in the landscape. So when you think about the quote of the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, we don't want to be known as an industry and then you need to replant them every 6 to 10 years. So really quality matters for our reputation. Quality matters for us to be able to provide the services that we say we're going to provide. And I know you all know this already, but some folks maybe that haven't been in the industry as long maybe don't realize some of the poor quality material that has been around in the past. This example slide here, you can see on the left what was standard quality live oak grown in Florida 40 or 50 years ago. Live oaks, if you don't know, can grow to be 60, 80, 100 feet tall, depending on the amount of soil space they're given. And the structure of that tree is absolutely horrid and will not lead to long-term success. it will lead to this happening, which is included bark, large codominant trunks. And then this particular tree photo I got from Ed Gilman, he had the luck of being able to go back to that site about 7 years later, and you can see how that tree failed. This is very common with live oak, and it's also, live oak is one of the largest planted trees in the Southeast. But not just with the really large maturing trees, also just with the issue of included bark, codominant stems, even in some smaller maturing trees or medium maturing trees, how that can lead to included bark and long-term failure, in parking lots or in park settings. Of course, we've learned a lot over the last 20 to 30 years about roots as well. So it's not just about what we see above ground. Quality is what's going on below the ground as well. So whether it's trees that are planted too deep in the nursery and then have girdling, circling roots that are formed, or planted too deep in the landscape, and therefore these roots coming up into the upper soil profile end up girdling, or whether they're deformed roots from the production method itself, from a container or from the liner tray. We've learned a lot about root quality and have incorporated that into much of what we do in Florida as well. Of course, we just had a hurricane come through yesterday. This is a pretty common sight in Florida after we have a tropical storm, or honestly, even just summer thunderstorms. But we also know that roots give the tree the long-term stability they need in the landscape, and that circling roots and root deformities from production can lead to failure. So advantages to quality trees and why we are concerned about them and talking about them today: their success long-term, greater longevity in the landscape, reduced maintenance and care, and just less likely to fail in becoming that part of the urban forest that we want them to be. In Florida, we've actually worked so closely with the nursery and arboriculture industry that some of us anyway, like this, have coined this phrase: arboriculture starts in the nursery. So instead of having that horrible structure, live oak, we now have hundreds and thousands of live oaks being grown with good, scientifically proven structure. And really, most of the credit for that goes to the Florida grades and standards for trees. So I'm going to move into talking about sort of the history and just a little bit of an overview of those grades and standards next. But the grades and standards is a document that has been around for a little over 60 years, 60 to 70 years. It was proposed way back in the 50s, and the Florida legislature passed a bill that said we would have grades and standards for all plant material grown in Florida. It really back then was more just about establishing sort of a base level quality. It wasn't necessarily an arboriculture basis so much as, you'd have a full canopy and a straight trunk. It didn't really get into much detail of what we know about what a quality tree is today. But we had a major revision of those grades and standards. In 1998 is when they went into effect. They had been worked on since the late 80s and through the early 90s. The industry went to the state and said, we would like to revise these and make them something that can be used in our industry. Because we knew that tree quality of planting can have such a great impact on the landscapes. And really, the landscapes and the tree planting in Florida had been growing, the need for, the importance of, and we wanted to make sure as an industry that what we were putting in the ground was going to be the quality plants that were expected. The 4 grades that the grades and standards provide for: the Florida Fancy, Florida number 1, Florida number 2, and Nicole. Really, Florida Fancy and Florida number 1 are what are used 99% of the time in the industry. So just a little bit more on the history. Again, the major revision in 1998 really introduced significant changes with a 10-step process for trees. This was a huge turning point for the industry. Even though the industry did go to the state and ask for this, I don't want you to think there wasn't a lot of pushback. There was definitely pushback. One of the slogans coined during that time was nature grows a better tree. So the idea of just plant a tree and whatever comes of it, that's what was meant to be. And it doesn't matter that you have these big codominant stems hanging over cars and buildings, because that's the way that tree naturally would grow. But thankfully, the majority of the industry was supportive, and the Grades and Standards is a voluntary program. The state does not enforce that if you're going to grow plant material, you must use these. But that voluntary program really became a mandatory program because we had widespread adoption of the Grades and Standards in landscape architect specifications, as well as municipal codes and ordinances. So really, if you want to be planting trees in any major projects, they're likely going to come with part of their specifications saying Florida #1 or better. There have been a couple updates since the 1998 major revision. So what I'm going to show you today is a 7-step, sort of simplified, updated, streamlined process. But really, the bottom line is the Grades and Standards just provide a great vehicle for buyer and seller communication. So when I tell you you're going to get a Florida #1, you have a really good idea of what that's going to look like when the trees arrive on your job site. Again, the 4 grades, Florida Fancy and Florida #1, are what are spec'd 90% of the time. Florida #2 occasionally, and we're going to see some examples of what those would look like. So the 7-step process, just going to spend a minute or two going through this, but step 1 says you choose a matrix. That basically means you identify the species that you're grading, and you look it up on a chart, and that chart will tell you what the minimum height could be, what the minimum spread could be based on the caliper of the tree that you're measuring. Also will tell you the root ball size that you need for that size tree. So step 1 is really just identifying the tree and measuring the trunk caliper so that you can use that to look at the chart and determine that it meets all those minimums later on in step 5. So that's step 1. Step 2 is trunk structure. This says that we have a main dominant trunk through the canopy on all large maturing species. We do not have to have a dominant trunk on small maturing species. So we can grow trees that aren't expected to become large and become more of a risk later in their life. We can grow those with multiple trunks, or we can grow multiple trunk trees, from the ground as well, as long as they are a small maturing species. So step 1 and 2, what are we growing? How big is it? And does it have a nice dominant trunk? Step 3 is about crown uniformity. The original standards had sort of a lollipop head and basically said if you've got a perfect little head with no holes, you're good. We now have made it a little bit more appropriate for different tree species that may have variation in their crowns. So I'll show you those in just a minute. Step 4 is really just recording the lowest grade that you have in step 2 and 3. So if I'm grading a live oak and my trunk structure is good and my crown uniformity is good, I move to step 4 and I have a Florida Fancy. Then in step 5, we're looking at, for the size of the tree, is the height correct? Is the crown diameter wide enough? Does the root ball hold together? Is the root ball the right size? And does the tree need a stake to hold it up? We call those the major downgrading factors. It only takes one of those to be true to downgrade a Florida Fancy to a Florida #1 or to a Florida #2. Step 6, minor downgrading factors are things like flush cuts, branch stubs, trunk wounds, any sort of 10% greater than 10% chlorosis, necrosis, or pest damage, a thinner crown, or included bark. And then last but not least, step 7 is root structure. In root structure, we look at the depth of the main root coming out of the trunk. We look at circling roots that could be deformed inside that root ball. And we also look at if there are lateral roots coming out over any deformed roots. So kind of covering a lot with y'all in a short period of time today. There's a lot more information about root structure and all of these, but I'm just trying to give you a quick overview of the issues that we're looking at when we're grading a tree. So those are the 7 steps. Just a look at what, from the document itself, what it shows a Florida Fancy tree would look like, and what the characteristics would be with a nice single trunk, branch diameter smaller than 2/3 of the trunk measured directly above it. So in other words, if we have these major branches in there, they have to be smaller than 2/3 of the diameter of the trunk measured right above that point. We look at tree height, crown diameter, make sure those are properly proportioned, make sure we have a uniform crown. Again, that we have the right size root ball, that we don't have an overgrown tree that's going to have lots of root deformities or fail in the landscape. Basically, to be a Florida Fancy, you can have no downgrading factors. I will point out to you, some of those crowns don't look quite as uniform, but our goal with the grades and standards is not that every tree looks like it's coming off of an assembly line and has been manufactured, by Lego, and every one is exactly identical. The goal is to make sure that we have a good, healthy, no real reason to downgrade the quality, even though it may have a small hole. That's a Florida Fancy. Florida number 1, if you have a co-dominant leader in the top half of the tree, it still can be a Florida number 1. So that is what probably 95% of specs in Florida say is Florida number 1 or better. So you can have a co-dominant in the top half of the tree and still be a Florida number 1. Obviously, it would just need a little bit of pruning to correct that long term. It can also have some kind of minor trunk injury or other downgrade and still be a Florida number 1. Florida number 2 are trees that have a double leader, co-dominant leader in the bottom half of the tree. Again, you can see, from the pictures, these aren't necessarily coals. There might be a bow in the trunk, might be a dog leg in the trunk. They're not necessarily coals, but they're not the level of quality that most folks would expect to be purchasing. So they may require more major pruning, or defects would take longer to correct. So there's definitely a market for these in a small way. But for the most part, folks don't want to buy Florida number 2s unless they're, working on a project that for some reason would allow for that. So again, these 7 steps, you start at 1, you end up at 7. 7 just has step 7, which is root structure, is really just pass fail. If you have major root issues, they make the tree a coal, and we can talk more about that in the question and answer. Just industry impact, the tree quality has increased dramatically in Florida. We have a universal spec, we have common terminology, increased professionalism. There are still challenges. We still are putting words to living organisms. So there's subjectivity, consistency with how trees are graded. They may be specified on jobs, but then there's no enforcement to make sure that that level of quality is what's being installed, which for the quality growers is a bad thing, because we can say it's a Florida number 1 on the specs, but then drive by and see that they were actually Florida number 2s or coals. So there's definitely still some challenges in the industry. And then going to finish today talking about Roots Plus growers. Roots Plus growers started in the mid-90s to guarantee consumers that they're buying high quality field grown trees. Like Andrew mentioned in my introduction, field grown trees are not the most popular method of growing trees in the state, or maybe in the Southeast. Container production really took off in the late 80s, mid 80s, late 80s, and early 90s. In that time frame, we were having to find a way to market that really the quality trees that we grow are a great production method. So this joining together as an industry group and saying, we're going to educate consumers about what quality plants we do grow, and sort of fight back a little bit on the container narrative from that time. It's been really successful. Not only do we just try to educate consumers, we participate in education and research by sponsoring different events and holding workshops at our growers' farms and sponsoring research even with the University of Florida to say, not only do we say our method is good, but can we have some research that actually backs that up for us as well? Essentially, what we're about is that you can have a quality field-grown tree. That the native soils of field production is actually a benefit to establishment in the landscape, and that if you're going to buy a field-grown tree, you should buy one that's been hardened off. And hardening off is what we call holding the tree in the nursery for at least a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks after harvesting. So the way I like to summarize it is we're not taking any stress that is caused from harvesting when we obviously are going to cut some roots, even if we've done root pruning. So any stress at that harvesting time is not also added to the stress of loading trees on a truck and planting them in the job site. So we separate any stress that may be associated with harvesting from transporting and transplanting into the landscape. So just some photos of what the hardened off, if a tree has roots coming out of the burlap, like these photos show, that's considered hardened off. And we like to say that quality field-grown trees must be hardened off, just like quality container-grown trees need to be rooted out. And then as the grower group, we put these tags on trees so that if you get a tree delivered to your job site that does not have roots coming out of the burlap, you would be able to call or go online and sort of report that. So we've done a great job with this. Landscape architects and municipalities, developers will specify RPG trees sometimes. Sometimes they'll say RPG or container. But what we're trying to do is separate ourselves from the nurseries that may dig trees and load them the same day. In our environment in Florida, we found that those trees are much more stressed, and that's not a good production method for 99% of species. And then just some of the research that we've done with the university and at our own nurseries, just understanding what makes quality, removing any defects before planting, hardening off for the Roots Plus grower requirement, like we talk about, putting trees in the right size root ball, not letting them get overgrown, and making sure we have straight lateral roots. And then already talked a little bit about some of those benefits for field-grown trees. We're not trying to say that you can't grow quality roots in a container-grown production method. They just would need the same requirements, straight roots. You need to remove defects and use root manipulating containers, probably shaving at every step. And that's just some of the research that we've supported, and some of the results that we've gotten, just showing what production method does best depending on the circumstances. And just to summarize, under limited irrigation, root pruned or hardened off trees do the best. Containers, because they're lighter and don't have as much water holding capacity in most cases, are kind of in the middle. This is if we're under limited irrigation. And then recently dug field-grown trees with fresh cuts on root systems are going to do the worst. Under appropriate intensive irrigation, any production method can do well, but in Florida at least, many times appropriate intensive irrigation is lacking. So that's all that I have today, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to answering questions later on.
Very nice. Thanks for plugging the trees. Are cool license plate. Go get that if you're in Maryland or whatever, if you can. Our plate, it helps support research down here in Florida. So that was a great. Whoever came up with that idea, and you're probably behind that too, Mike. That was great. So